Good. So I'm here with Brian Peck today. I'm happy to meet you again. And we had a bit of a conversation already a few weeks ago to kind of get to know each other a bit and see what your background is. And you contacted me through Facebook initially, and I had a look on your website. I saw quite some interesting things like the orientation or working with religious trauma or people who've gone through trauma in a religious context. And I'd like to pick your brain a little bit more of what you're doing, what you're up to, what your direction is with this. You also mentioned the word deconversion on your website, and I thought that was a really interesting way of putting it, using that word. So, what has drawn you to focus on this group of people, if I may ask?
Yeah, for sure. And I just want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss this more. And I've really enjoyed following your work as well. And I think part of what I'm hoping to do with bringing a trauma-informed approach to religious trauma is to collaborate with folks like yourself and to bring in more kind of clinical voices from a diverse background to, utilize those skills for helping folks who have experienced religious trauma. So I think religious trauma is actually, I have a definition that we've come up with, and it's basically the physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that overwhelmed an individual's ability to cope and return to a sense of safety. And so we can see like acute religious trauma resulting from a single incident. This chronic religious trauma is this results from repeated or prolonged adverse religious experiences. And then complex religious trauma, resulting from exposure to varied or multiple adverse religious experiences, often of kind of invasive or interpersonal nature. And so I think, to say it really succinctly, religious trauma is trauma that occurs within a religious context or as a result of being exposed to like a harmful religious belief or practice or structure. And so it's going to vary from person to person. We're looking at it through the lens of the nervous system. If your nervous system is having this kind of survival response and this trauma response to an event, that's what we're focused on. We're not saying that specific beliefs are inherently harmful, but each person's going to have a different response to those. And as we've seen this kind of cultural shift over time where religion is becoming less important in some people's lives and people are transitioning outside of religious groups, maybe where they grew up in, that process of leaving can also be really painful and difficult and can result in some trauma as well, as people kind of, these attachments that they had within a religious structure, now they're faced with, how do I relate to the world outside of this structure? And that can be, that's that kind of deconversion process that I've referred to. And just so you know, I'm not 100% sold on that particular term, because what we're trying to describe is this process that can take years. Sometimes it can be brief for some folks, but sometimes it can take, years or decades of transitioning from maybe a very fundamentalist or rigid kind of way of viewing the world in a religious context, and then into a more open and more connected to your own personal values kind of way of living. And in that process, deconversion is kind of a bit of a play on words. You've been converted to this religion, and this is the kind of the other side of that, the leaving it, the deconverting oneself. And the reason why I'm reluctant, I use the term because it's widely accepted within a lot of post-religious communities. But I recognize that a lot of folks never were, quote unquote, converted. They grew up inside of it. It was their life from day one. And so, so there's not this sense of actually, undoing something that was done. They just started inside of it. And so, I haven't come up with a really great term that kind of captures that process, but that's what we're talking about, is a process of all the various things that happen as a result of leaving one's faith.
Okay. Thanks for giving some insight onto that.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, one thing is interesting that you mentioned that as you work with religious trauma, that just to make really sure, clear that you're not against religion,
Hmm.
but that there's that focus on helping people who've gone through trauma
Right.
within a religious context. I think it's good to emphasize that once more.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I'm really glad you did emphasize that once more, because um, religious trauma, I've been following this conversation for years now, and um, there's a concept out there, religious trauma syndrome, that um, has really just taken the DSM symptoms for various diagnoses and kind of drawn comparisons between what folks experience typically inside of very fundamentalist religious groups and high demand or high control groups, and then just kind of making these connections, and then using the term religious trauma syndrome to describe this kind of whole cluster of experiences that a person may have. And I'm not opposed to the idea of that, because I think it is helpful for folks to recognize that we can experience trauma in lots of different contexts. And it's important to recognize that religion can be viewed as a strength and as a way of having connection for folks, but also as a way of control in this aversive way, in a way that's harmful.
Mm.
And so I appreciate that piece of it. However, the term religious trauma syndrome has come to mean religion is bad, religion is categorically harmful, and it's been adopted by a lot of atheist groups as a way to just kind of pathologize religion,
Mm.
which for me doesn't feel super helpful, because we want to recognize the harmful pieces that happen within inside religious
Mm.
contexts. But those power and control structures are similar across domains. I mean, they're
Mm.
within family structures, within
Absolutely.
organizational structures, political structures. And so when we start saying, well, religion is bad and harmful because we don't believe in these beliefs that they have,
Mm.
it gives folks the impression that if I just get rid of religion or leave religion, then I'm going to be fine, and or that's going to be healing in some way on its own. And so I think it sets folks up to not have a really good experience leaving religion if the assumption is once I exit, then I'm going to be okay.
Mm.
Or if socially we could, diminish the power of religion in society or get rid of it altogether, that somehow that would result in a less trauma in our world.
Mm.
And I just don't see that being the case, because like I said, it's these underlying components that give rise to these contexts where folks can be harmed. And if we're not talking about those pieces, it's almost like religion becomes a scapegoat. It's this thing that we
Yeah.
identify as
Becomes
harmful.
reactive.
Yeah, for sure. And so I think that's there's a shift happening, and I'm happy to be part of that, where we are focusing more on religious trauma through this nervous system lens, through a more trauma-informed lens. It's not
Mm.
the the abuse that you experienced that we're so focused on. It's it's your body's response to that, and if we
Mm.
can understand that and help folks recover through that lens, I
Mm.
think that's that's a useful conversation to have.
Right.
How can we move forward and heal from this, as opposed to we just need to rail against the abuse that we see.
Mm.
There's a place for both things, to identify abuse when it's happening and to hold organizations accountable for abuse. I completely 100% agree with that. And recognizing that that's not treating trauma. That's not, there's a separate
Mm.
process that needs to happen to focus on the
Mm.
trauma piece.
Right. Well said. Uh, mm. What is your particular or your interest that got you involved with working with people who have gone through religious trauma?
Yeah, I think many of us who, are kind of in these helping professions, have either experienced or witnessed some of the suffering that we're addressing in our work, and that's certainly the case for me. I think that the archetype of wounded healer, we've been hurt in some way, and we're intimately connected to a certain experience or a certain kind of suffering, and then I think we're more sensitive to seeing that in others. And so, having gone through my own experience of being harmed within a religious context, and then experiencing the challenge and the struggle of leaving one's faith. And then you start connecting with other folks who have gone through that experience. And for me, I was just starting to identify a lot of areas where people were getting stuck. So often this deconversion process that we're talking about, I referenced, it starts out as a very cognitive process. I think the reason why it's very cognitive for folks is fundamentalism, in most cases, is about this literal truth, right? The truth is in the words, it's in the sacred text. It's like you have to take things literally as being absolutely true because they're written down in a certain way. And we recognize like that's very cognitively focused. That's my thoughts are the most important thing. My beliefs are the most important thing. And in fact, sometimes people can't separate themselves from their beliefs. They're the same thing. And so when they start to have questions and doubts and they go through that process and they start reading a lot and uncovering why these particular beliefs don't hold water anymore, they're not healthy for me, they're not okay for me anymore, then it tends to be, let me find the evidence that proves this wrong, which can be a useful process if a person's breaking away from something that no longer works for them. However, it's a place to get stuck because now you're living in this kind of reaction to your former beliefs. And folks will swing from one extreme to the other often. And I myself went through this process. A fundamentalist evangelical Christian swinging way over to this other extreme of like, now I need to be absolutely certain about the world in this very kind of naturalistic and more progressive way of seeing things. And it wasn't that my beliefs weren't objectively healthier for me. It was that I was holding on to them so tightly or pushing against my old beliefs so firmly that I was getting stuck there. And so I think I was noticing that process happening over and over and over again within online groups of folks who had left the religion, where they were just kind of stuck in this pushing against their old beliefs. And it felt very, stuck in this realm of thoughts and beliefs, as opposed to your whole person and what's important to me and who do I want to be in the world, connecting to your personal values and living more fully in your body. And so
I think partly, sorry to interrupt, but I think partly it might also be part of a healing process. That first there's a lot of emotion that's suppressed, either be it anger or anxiety or sadness. And then once there's some sense of freedom, kind of the pendulum swings to the other side, and you first have to react to kind of remove yourself from it. And then realize that, you might kind of stay too long in that space of blame and reacting, that at some point you say, okay, well, that's not healthy either.
And I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I was part of, and I want to be clear that I'm not in any way diminishing the need for anger and aggression, because I think from a trauma-informed lens, oftentimes folks are in this more freeze collapse state or please appease. You need to go along with what the church is telling you. You need to go along with what these religious leaders are insisting that you do. And so that feels like this more, from a polyvagal theory, this kind of dorsal vagal or this freeze collapse place where as long as I don't make waves, I get to survive, And so when folks are in that state, there needs to be this kind of aggressive pushing away. And so, for me, I like to think of that as aggression in the service of connection. So if I can push these beliefs, these structures, these practices away and say, no, that's not for me. I'm not here for this. That allows you to feel safe again, strong again, have enough power that you can engage these topics without being as activated around them. You still might feel activated, but it feels like if I know that I can push that away or protect myself, I'm no longer stuck in that reactive state. And so I think for me, I recognize that going from that freeze collapse state to a more safe and social state does require us going through an activated state. And so I don't want to diminish that at all. I think what I've observed where people get stuck is it feels activated, but it's very heady. It's very cognitive focused, right?
Mm.
So I need to like prove to you that you're wrong in order for me to feel safe. And I think you can make some progress along that line of approach. I think, although I'm not convinced you can make a lot of progress,
Mm.
there's this more kind of embodied focus of, can I viscerally, physically feel safe again by doing the things that
Mm.
inform my nervous system that I'm safe again. And that can be, you know, saying the things you need to say out loud to a person, or even just approximating those conversations,
Mm.
having the sense of pushing away, physically pushing away, whether it's with a real person or just in this kind of, you know, not imagined, but like this embodied way of pushing away, you know, these beliefs and practices that no longer work for you.
Mm.
When you feel safe enough, then those beliefs that you once held are no longer threatening to you. That threat, you realize that I can do what's necessary to be safe again. And I think
Mm.
there's a difference between, I know that cognitively, because folks will tell me all the time, I no longer believe in hell, but I still feel this fear.
Mm.
And so they're puzzled by that at times, like, well, why do I still have this physical response and reaction to this doctrine if I no longer believe it? And that's, again, the difference between I know something cognitively and I know something viscerally. When they
Somatic.
first encountered that belief about hell, you know, their body went into a state of like, you know, fear and being paralyzed by fear. I'm
Mm.
overcome, overwhelmed. This is too big. I can't handle this. I can't escape this. And to cognitively say, well, that never was true, or it's not true now, that just doesn't impact your felt sense experience of
Mm.
safety, like viscerally, physically feeling safe again. And so sometimes in the work I do, we'll imagine those moments where you first encountered these doctrines, and and what would it be like to, as a kid, to say, no, that's, I see what you're doing. This is fear trying to control me, and I'm not okay with that. And to sense what that feels like, to have that kind of power and control in that situation, that's really powerful for folks. It's a visceral physical experience. It's not just a,
Mm.
you know, I've done enough research to decide that I no longer believe this. It's like, it's a
Right.
felt sense experience.
It resonates very much with, yeah, how I work with my clients or some of the work I do. And yeah, I get people from a whole range of backgrounds, not just
Mm-hmm,
religiously, but
sure.
also just a lot of family context where the
Mm-hmm.
same feelings,
Yeah.
sensations, emotions
Right.
kind of come through, the kind of control, and
Mm-hmm.
might be religious, or might be, you know, just a father or mother figure who's been
Mm-hmm.
overbearing, and that moving away from that power structure very often involves guilt.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, breaking away from a power structure and
Yeah.
re-owning those healthy boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right. Yeah. I think it's so important. And I think in some ways, religious trauma, you know, looks very similar to that kind of developmental trauma, that the caregiver who is a source of safety and connection,
mm,
whether it be a religious leader or a deity that you've been, you know, taught about,
mm,
or even, you know, a parent inside of a religious context, there's that, this is my source of safety and connection. And then
mm.
also, this person's hurting me, punishing
That's the
me,
conundrum.
controlling me. And so then how do you, how do you navigate that as a child, and then even as an adult, like that, the impact of that is long lasting
Mm,
unless you address that. And yeah, I'm
mm.
aware of that struggle. I think,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, looking
I
at
think
through a trauma and
even
attachment lens, yeah, there's lots of ways of seeing that.
uh, what I encounter very often is that difficulty of starting to set boundaries, because then
Mm-hmm.
kind of the guilt or the anxiety
Yes.
comes up of might be rejected by the person.
Mm-hmm.
It also is a safety person or a structure that's also a safety structure.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that conundrum or dilemma to, like, okay, am I going to establish a new sense of self
Mm-hmm.
with the fear of collapsing or being
Right.
rejected? Or am I going to keep being part of either the religious structure or the family structure? And even long after the incident or those experiences have passed, where rationally they're in a safe
Mm-hmm.
place, that
Right.
on an emotional somatic level, they're still living in that place of not being
Yes.
able to voice themselves. Or, I work sometimes with kind
Mhm.
of body expression of
Yes.
raising
Yeah.
a hand, and it's terrifying. So I
It
think it's
is.
good to kind of hold those perspectives of kind of the control, breaking out of control through a
Mhm.
healthy anger and boundaries response. But
Right.
then when there's that inability or freeze or anxiety coming up, that there's that deeper structure of the need for validation, wanting to
Mhm.
be loved, wanting to be
Yeah.
safe,
Yes.
and that needs to be addressed simultaneously
Yeah.
as you work with, call it deconversion or
Mhm.
healthy
Sure.
boundaries,
Yeah.
reestablishing a healthy sense of self. And
Yeah.
so it's
Yeah,
good to
I
hear
think
that
that.
there's overlap between
Oh
kind of what
yeah,
you're saying
for sure.
and I worked with people from different religious contexts as
Mhm.
well. Quite a
Yeah.
few with them coming from the kind of Christian boarding schools in
Mhm.
England and
Oh,
Ireland.
sure.
People are in their 50s, 60s, 70s
Mm.
now because a lot of
Yeah.
that has changed,
Sure.
fortunately. And then also in the States, there's a kind of the Mormon communities are still
Mhm.
quite strong.
Sure.
And some of the specifics I've seen, and you've mentioned them in the beginning, is that kind of moving away out of that structure and starting to kind of see what possibilities there are outside of that structure, but also
Mhm.
the difficulties to
Right.
kind of move away from it. Now, just to follow up on that, would you be able to kind of say a few more specifics of what might involve religious trauma? I mean, one thing is that moving away from the kind of religious community and all the struggles that might
Mhm.
involve that. Would you pinpoint a few other things that you come across very often?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's very unique to each person's experience. And so just kind of, having that as the preface. But often, when we think about trauma through this idea of there was something that I experienced where I needed to do something to protect myself, to feel safe, to feel autonomous. And I was prohibited from doing that. The system was too big, too strong. I was overwhelmed. And we think about, our nervous system, we want to be kind of safe and social and open and connected as much as possible. But then when a threat arises, we go into this, kind of activated fight or flight state. And if we're able to neutralize that threat, push away effectively, or escape to safety, then we go back to feeling safe and social again. If we're unable to do that because we don't have the internal or external resources, the threat is too big and too strong. It's not safe to escape. I can't run away because that entails more abuse, more suffering. Then we go into this kind of freeze collapse state as a way of surviving, or feigning, or this pleasing and appeasing. And so when we think about really high demand religious structures, this is a context where folks can easily be pushed into this freeze collapse state, because it's not okay to question or to push back or
Mm.
to say, you don't treat me this way, I don't believe this anymore. And especially for kids, but even adults, when we think about how powerful some of these um, religious leaders are in terms of their you know charisma and control, and just the structures. When you have a system where you have your needs met on various levels when you're part of the group, and we'll bring you food when you're sick, we'll make sure you're taken care of, we'll provide you all this security and safety, but then the price of that is you have to live in this kind of freeze collapse state. Then we can see the potential for trauma in those settings.
Mm.
And so I think sometimes it's something on a more doctrinal or belief level. It's this idea of you can't trust your body's evil and sinful, and you just need to believe the right things. And so you have folks who are disconnected from their innate sense of what's right and wrong, or what's safe for me, or what's okay or what's not okay for me. And so you have to kind of suppress your instinctive nervous system response to experiences and say, well,
Mm.
I don't feel comfortable doing this thing I'm being asked to do, but I guess I'm wrong because my body's evil and I can't trust it, right? And so
Right.
you become
Yeah.
disconnected from this resource that you have that's so vital to human survival and thriving, right? If we don't have access to this kind of vital life force, this ability to recognize threat and to push away and do what's necessary, and we just defer to other authority, we start to feel more and more powerless. And then I'm not saying that religion has set out to exploit that, but whether it's intentional or not, that often happens. If we can keep you in a place where you need us and you're not safe without us, that dynamic starts to create this sense of, I'm not able to do this on my own. And so then I think that does result in a lot of potential for trauma.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, I see the parallels between not just the religious context, but people who have gone to kind of yoga cults or yoga communities.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Where the leader takes on a certain status, and then
Sure.
all these similar things happen, like the power play, the rewiring of the brain, of going against what you feel is natural, but then the belief systems that kind of overpower that what you feel in the body, your felt sense.
Yeah, and I think I actually just watched the documentary on Netflix, Bikram, right? And so you see the cult of Bikram yoga, and it's hard to watch, to see that amount of control, and then also that amount of trust that's being exploited. And so you think about religious systems where there's these beliefs that are absolutely true, and if you don't believe them, then you're wrong. And you see how that can be used against folks, and in ways that they no longer trust themselves. They no longer have access to their internal sense of what's safe and okay for me. And so I think of that, creating a context where abuse can happen, where trauma can happen. And I also want to point out that this often is the case where a person will go through this process, will leave religion, will have been traumatized inside of a religious context, and they'll talk to their friends and family, and their friends and family will say, well, but that belief didn't hurt me at all. I wasn't bothered by that. I was fine. So it can't be, that the belief itself was bad. And so if we're just focusing on the belief is harmful or religion is harmful, we can't really communicate to believers why it is that my nervous system detected that as threat, and why it's important to recognize that if you want to have a religious organization or structure that is more, trauma informed, more, approaching this harm reduction model where we still hold our beliefs and we still maintain that we're right about how the world works, but we're not going to be putting people in survival mode and, traumatizing them in the way that we kind of act that out. And so, so I think it's important to move the conversation away from, well, this belief in hell is inherently traumatizing, because it won't traumatize folks who have enough safety and connection in their experience, right? If they have, so I think just really recognizing that distinction is important. And then also looking for points of resilience as well, points of connection. And so why is one person's experience resulting in trauma, but another isn't? And I mean, there's some things that I see more often, women who don't have a lot of power or control in a religious context, members of the LGBTQ community who don't have a lot of power in a certain religious context. And then, your cishet white male in a religious context who has massive amounts of power in some of these, religions. And we'll predict that folks who have less power are going to experience more trauma. And that's what we see. Yeah. And so I think seeing those power dynamics and what's at play is really important. So it's a conversation not so much about, religion is harmful, but it's this conversation of what are these various beliefs, practices, and structures that contribute to a person not having enough safety, enough power to be okay.
And it makes it a lot more difficult when you grow up in either family structure or religious community from birth onwards, because you're missing out by birth. If there is a kind of control structure, you're missing out on a sense of safety to start with. Yeah. And the other thing is the kind of the chicken and egg thing, that which comes first. Is it kind of the belief or the religion that comes first, or is it that lack of validation, safety, and unloved that makes you get drawn into those
Mhm.
structures because
Right.
you're looking for its opposite. If you're unloved, you're
Right.
looking for being loved. If you're
Yeah.
unvalidated, you're looking for being validated.
Mhm.
And I mean, I know that kind of narcissism, or the word narcissism, is really
Mhm.
out there, and you see the same kind of patterns, the please, please
Mhm. Right.
kind of personality who gets attracted to somebody who makes abuse of that out
Mhm.
of their own need for validation, but in a kind of
Right.
more
Yeah. Someone
way.
someone shared something recently that really resonates with what you're saying, and how they said it. I won't get it exactly right, but it's not that how is it? It's not that religion is like kind of predatory on its own, but it attracts folks who are drawn to um, a lot of control and secrecy, and where
Mm,
kind of male dominance is validated and accepted. And so we're not saying that, you know, religion is trying to do this to
mm,
harbor predators, but we're recognizing that predators can feel very safe inside of a lot of religious contexts because there's massive amounts of secrecy, there's a lot of control, and you're not to be questioned, right?
mm,
And also there's this need to protect the organization. And so again, I don't think religions are, you know, trying to, you know, appeal to, you know, predators, but certainly, you know, the narcissist, the predator, the person who wants to control and exploit other people, well, they're going to find groups where it's easier to do that. And so if we're looking at organizational structures that allow for that and perpetuate that, um, you know, that allows us to talk about, you know, how do you you know, be more transparent or more open? How do you limit control in ways, or how do you give your members more control? And
mm,
so I think those are important conversations, as opposed to, you know, we just see all these cases of you know, predators exploiting folks inside of religion. Well, why is that? I think that's a more important question than like, well, there must be something inherently wrong with religion
mm.
itself,
Kind
or
of
it's the
opening up
beliefs
a
themselves.
dialogue.
Yeah.
Mm. All right. Good. Okay. So for if you would speak to people who are listening to this conversation that we have and something resonates with them,
Mm-hmm.
would you have certain steps or direct suggestions that you would have for them, how they could
Mm-hmm.
search for help, or what kind of, is there a certain, I don't want to say a 12-step thing, but
Yeah.
are there
Yeah, sure.
certain things they can focus on to bit by bit, not to get overwhelmed and,
Yeah.
work on those issues?
Yeah. And, you know, I wish there were simple stages that folks go through and it's fairly consistent and linear, but obviously that's not the world we live in. That's not the
Mm,
human experience. And so I think the big things I would want folks to recognize is that they need safety. They need to feel strong and safe again. And
mm,
that's not going to happen on their own. That's going to happen in relationship to others who are hearing them, who are validating their experience, who understand, and creating enough safety where they can begin to do some of this work. And so,
mm,
you know, as much as I wish there were trauma therapists who also were really aware of the specific dynamics of religious trauma, I think that working with a trauma therapist of any kind, as long as they're open to understanding how these various religious elements harmed you, and they can do that trauma work around that, I would be encouraging folks to do that if they can.
mm,
Um, and and I value folks telling their stories, and I think there's value in that, in getting that sense of, you know, I'm not alone, and other people are hearing what I'm saying. And yet, I also am aware that that can be re-traumatizing. That can be difficult. It's not enough on its own to just be seen and heard and
mm,
recounting my story, you know. And so I would want folks to also recognize that it can be tempting to just get stuck in this cognitive space and find out all the reasons why my religion was wrong and what they taught me was harmful and how
mm,
that's impacted me. But if there's not a sense of what do I do next, how can I move forward? How can I feel safer and more empowered, more
mm,
you know, able to to be myself in the world, no amount of thinking about that, I guess, you can't think yourself out of trauma, right? You can't cognitively convince yourself that I'm safe and okay now, because there's that felt sense. Yeah, I know. We'd love to try. We certainly do. And I think, I think that's why we have a lot of, books and groups and people telling their stories, sharing their experience. And again, I see value in that, if we're doing that through this trauma lens of like, now what do we do next? And how can this story be a powerful experience for you viscerally, physically? How can this be embodied? How can you integrate this story into your life now that you're feeling safer and stronger? But just recounting it, reliving that, isn't going to be enough. And so I guess that would be a caution I would have, just noticing the impulse to do that. And then, if you can, and I know it's hard to do this, and I know there's a certain amount of privilege implied in finding a therapist, right? I get that. But recognizing the need for connection, the need for validation, the need for that other human nervous system who's there for you, so that it creates a context where you can process through some of this stuff. That can happen in different ways. And so I think noticing that you can trust your body again, you can tune into your nervous system, you can be more aware of your felt sense experience. And that's new for a lot of folks who've left this very, high demand religion where it was all about the beliefs. And so I would encourage folks to look for more embodied ways to be human, dance, yoga, anything that's movement oriented, where they can start to really tune into and notice and connect with their body. And so I think there's just lots of different ways that people can address this. For me, pointing at the need for that to be through some trauma-informed lens, some body-focused lens. I think that's something that a lot of religious folks aren't prepared to do, aren't familiar with doing. And in fact, they've lived a lot of their lives kind of thinking that these kinds of practices are bad and evil. And so to even open up to the possibility of maybe yoga is okay for me, or maybe, dance is okay, or some kind of movement is okay. I think the sense of curiosity that goes along with that is super, super powerful and healing. Can I, instead of like pushing away or holding tightly to something, can I just be open and like, can I experience and see what this is like? That can be incredibly powerful as well. So nothing specific, but some general ideas that might be useful.
I think that's good enough. Yeah, I would add to that the healing process is really a process that we often want to think, we want to be done with it yesterday and see it black and white, but then also breakdowns before breakthroughs, and you have to go steady and slowly and steady. And that just be aware that you have those moments where you feel that you come against yourself with these blocks that you have, which might be your inhibiting beliefs, and you feel that you take 2 steps forward and 3 steps backwards. And
and another thing I would add to that as well that has been really powerful for folks is, like you mentioned earlier, how shame and trauma are often connected, right? We talked about trauma as being the physical response to situations where I needed to do something to protect myself, but it wasn't safe to do that. And so my autonomic nervous system, without my permission, went into freeze collapse. And trauma survivors often have the experience of, well, I should have been able to do X, right? I should have been able to defend myself, run away, do whatever. And the reality is that they couldn't, even if they wanted to, they couldn't, because their nervous system is saying it's not safe to do that. And we evolved to, value, survival at any cost. And so freeze collapse is a way of surviving. And so it's a powerful thing to recognize that, and then to honor that, and in some ways celebrate that. I would never want to have that experience again. And yet I recognize that my body had my back in that moment. And I can appreciate that my nervous system is there for me, is doing what's necessary to survive. Again, we're not trying to silver line it. We're not trying to make it, better than it was, or dismiss what happened at all. But we're recognizing that if we get stuck in this, well, I should have been able to do something differently. we're dismissing the reality that my body is doing what's necessary to survive in moment to moment. And if we're resisting that, or that if that's a source of shame, or if it feels like that reinforces this sense of powerlessness, it will tend to get stuck there more. We'll stay in that kind of freeze collapse place because it feels like I shouldn't have let that happen. And
I even see those thought patterns as a way of dissociation. So you feel emotionally overwhelmed, be it by anger or sadness or anxiety, that you can't hold. And then at some point, your thoughts kind of just take over, and they always go with some form of guilt, shame, blame, self-reproach, embarrassment, self-righteousness, even, or pride, decisiveness, self-doubt. And so all those excessive thoughts, and as you said, they reinforce the traumatic state. But the moment you start to see that your body tries to protect itself by pushing the energy into the head, and that kind of diminishes those thought states and potentially make you able to connect again with that excess anxiety, anger, or sadness. But just to wrap it up, there's bit by bit, because I think we can keep.
I know there's so much here for sure, and I just really appreciate what you just said. I think that awareness is so important. I want to add just one tiny thing to that, because I think what you're saying, just to reinforce that in folks' minds, there's this. I think for me, I've learned that movement of any kind, noticing movement. Like there's hope inside of movement. Trauma often feels intractable. It feels stuck. It feels powerless. I can't move. I can't do. And as you're describing the way, even like as we kind of dissociate, right, there's a sense of like there's some movement inside of that. And can I come back into my body and notice, even if it's constricting, like there's this movement where now there's like this, constriction before I pounce or before I act, right? Can I see that even though it feels like it's getting more and more stuck and more compressed, if I'm noticing that there's still movement there? And so this awareness of movement in our physical states is just so helpful. And there's many ways that our bodies will do that. And it can be really helpful to be aware of that and see hope inside of that. If things are moving, even though it feels overwhelming and difficult in this activated state, where it feels stuck and powerless in this kind of freeze collapse state, if I'm paying attention, I start seeing little shifts here and there, and those can become bigger shifts, and we can start to move and move out of these states more easily.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Let's wrap it up here, and we can do a part 2 somewhere later down the line.
Oh, awesome. Sounds great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and I'll hope to continue this conversation at a later point.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Welcome.